I built an empire from nothing, brick by brick, design by design, dream by dream. I gave my son the world, only for him to call me useless and throw me out of the empire that carried our family name. He thought age had weakened me, that my silence meant surrender. But what Daniel never realized was that beneath every empire lies one foundation, the mother who built it. My name is Margaret Lawson, and I am 74 years old. For most of my life, people have known me as the founder of Lawson Properties and Designs, one of the most respected real estate and interior development companies in the southern United States. For decades, my name stood for elegance, precision, and trust. But tonight, as rain poured over the shining city of Atlanta, my name meant nothing. Not to the one person I loved the most. The night began like any other, quiet, polite, and hollow. My son, Daniel Lawson, had invited me for dinner at the house I once owned, the house whose walls I had personally designed down to the marble patterns on the floor. But this time, the atmosphere felt heavy. There was something different in the air, something colder than the rain outside. Daniel sat at the end of the dining table, his tailored suit crisp, his jaw tight with the kind of arrogance that success without gratitude often brings. Beside him sat his wife, Vanessa, whose expression had the softness of a diamond, beautiful but unyielding. "Mother," Daniel said, his tone clipped and rehearsed, "we need to talk about the company." I put down my fork and folded the napkin in my lap. "What about it?" He leaned back. "You've done enough. You built something extraordinary, but it's time to let someone else take over. The market is changing. We need modern leadership, someone who understands today's pace." Vanessa smiled faintly, stirring her wine. "He means it out of love, Margaret. You've worked hard. You deserve to rest." I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, the mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "I see," I said quietly. "You want me to step down." Daniel nodded, pretending to soften his voice. "Yes, and to make it official, I need you to sign a few documents. Just legalities. It'll simplify ownership transitions and tax matters." He slid a sleek folder across the table. I glanced at the papers, dense paragraphs of legal jargon, the kind that hides traps behind polite words. My hands may have trembled slightly, but my mind was clear. "Daniel," I said gently, "these aren't simplifications. These are ownership transfers. You're asking me to hand you everything your father and I built." He exhaled sharply. "Don't make this dramatic, Mom. You're not exactly in your prime anymore. Investors want stability." I looked him straight in the eye. "I am stability." Vanessa laughed softly, the sound brittle. "Come now, Margaret. No one is questioning your legacy. We're just trying to secure the future." I smiled faintly, an old woman's smile, one that hides more wisdom than warmth. "Whose future, Vanessa?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. After that, the conversation turned colder, sharper. Daniel's patience thinned, and my calm only seemed to irritate him more. He accused me of being controlling, of holding back innovation, of living in the past. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of revealing itself when arrogance starts shouting. Finally, Daniel's voice broke through the storm raging outside. "You're done, Mom. This company needs leadership that can actually keep up. You're holding us back." He stood, slammed the contract on the table, and hissed, "You're old, you're stubborn, and frankly, you're useless." The words hit harder than any thunder outside. For a moment, I didn't breathe. I just looked at my son, the boy whose first office I built with my own savings, whose education I paid for, whose dreams I carried even when mine were breaking. He turned his face away, refusing to look at me. Vanessa whispered something in his ear, and then he barked toward the butler, "Get her things. She's leaving tonight." It was then I realized, it wasn't just the rain pouring outside, it was the collapse of everything I'd built inside these walls. The servants stood frozen as I rose from my chair. I walked to the hallway, where the family portrait still hung, the one with Edward, my late husband, holding baby Daniel in his arms. I ran my fingers over Edward's face and whispered, "You warned me he'd lose himself." Daniel's voice echoed from behind me, "You can take your things, but you're not stepping foot in that office again." I turned, my posture straight, my voice calm. "Don't worry, Daniel. I built Lawson Properties without permission, and I don't need yours to protect it." His jaw clenched. "Protect it? From what?" I gave him one last look. "From you." Then I walked out into the storm. Rain lashed against my coat, my heels sank into the wet gravel, and lightning illuminated the massive mansion that no longer felt like home. But as I reached my car, I clutched the leather folder I'd hidden inside my handbag, the original property deeds and trust documents. Daniel thought he had taken everything. He didn't know the foundation of Lawson Properties still belonged to me. He took my roof, but not my roots. That night, as thunder cracked above the Atlanta skyline, I whispered to myself, "If he wants a war over what I built, then he's about to learn. Mothers don't surrender their legacies. They reclaim them." They say every empire begins with a dream. Mine began with a blueprint and a borrowed desk. Before I became Margaret Lawson, founder of Lawson Properties and Designs, I was just Margaret Ellis, a young girl from a small town in Savannah, Georgia, who used to sit on the porch sketching houses she knew she'd never live in. My father was a carpenter. He built walls for other people's homes. My mother decorated them with her imagination. From both of them, I inherited something rare. Not wealth, not influence, but vision. I still remember being 21, sitting in a tiny apartment that smelled like coffee and rain-soaked wood, staring at my first client's blueprint. The walls were uneven, the plan was rough, but when I closed my eyes, I could see beauty. Light pouring through arched windows, oak flooring that gleamed in the morning sun. That was my gift. I didn't just design spaces, I designed stories. That was the same year I met Edward Lawson. Edward wasn't like the other men I knew. He didn't laugh at my ambition or tell me to slow down, because I was a woman. He had the calm of a thinker and the fire of a dreamer. He worked as a junior architect for a small firm in Atlanta, and I was a freelance designer trying to make ends meet. We met at a real estate expo. I was there to hand out flyers for my design services. He was there pitching his firm's latest residential project. He noticed my sketches, the ones I'd drawn on the back of an old brochure, and said, "These aren't just houses. You draw like someone who knows how it feels to live inside them." That one sentence changed everything. We spent the next few months talking about architecture, art, and the future we wanted to build. I loved how he dreamed, not of fame or fortune, but of purpose. One night, as we sat on the roof of his old apartment, watching city lights shimmer across the skyline, he turned to me and said, "Someday, we'll build homes that outlive us." He kept his word. Within 2 years, we got married and started our first venture, a small design and construction studio we ran from our garage. We had one old drafting table, 2 chairs, and one thing money couldn't buy, faith. The first year, we made barely enough to survive. I still remember the nights we ate instant noodles by candlelight, marking up blueprints with trembling hands. But slowly, clients started noticing our work. Edward handled the architecture, I designed the interiors, added soul to the structures he brought to life. Then came our breakthrough, the Stanton Project. It was a modest contract to redesign a rundown Victorian home for a local business couple. We poured everything we had into it. Every ounce of skill, every hour of sleep, every drop of hope. When it was done, it looked like a painting come to life. White columns, soft lights, modern touches balanced with old charm. The project won Best Residential Design of the Year in a regional magazine. That one feature changed our lives. By the time I turned 35, Lawson Properties and Designs had grown into a respected name across Georgia. We expanded into commercial architecture, boutique hotels, and luxury residences. Our designs began appearing in magazines, and within a decade, we were handling projects across the South, from Atlanta to Charlotte to Austin. But we weren't just building structures. We were building our legacy. When our first child, Daniel, was born, Edward held him and said, "He'll inherit everything we build." I smiled then, never imagining those words would one day become a curse. 2 years later, our daughter Emily was born. Quiet, curious, gentle. She had my hands and Edward's eyes. From childhood, she'd sit beside me, sketching little homes and gardens while Daniel built towers out of toy blocks. Edward and I made sure our children never saw the poverty we came from. We gave them the best schools, the finest tutors, and a life filled with opportunity. But success, I later learned, is a double-edged sword. It gives your children everything, but it doesn't teach them what it costs. As the years passed, I began noticing the differences between them. Emily loved creating. She'd visit construction sites, help our designers choose palettes, even volunteer at our charity housing projects. She understood the heart of the business. Daniel, however, was drawn to power, meetings, numbers, control. He didn't care how a building felt, he only cared how much it sold for. Edward noticed it too. One night, when the kids were asleep, he said quietly, "Daniel's ambitious, Maggie. But ambition without gratitude, it can burn everything it touches." I brushed off his concern then, believing time would teach Daniel humility. I was wrong. In 2008, when the recession hit, our company faced its greatest challenge. Projects froze, clients vanished, and investors panicked. But Edward and I stood firm. We mortgaged our personal properties, sold our vacation home, and paid every employee on time. I remember saying to Edward, "We'll rebuild like we always do." He smiled but didn't answer. A week later, he collapsed in his office. Heart failure. Sudden. Final. The world around me shattered. For the first time, I felt the weight of the empire on my shoulders, not as a partner but alone. At his funeral, Daniel stood tall and confident, greeting investors and board members like he was already in charge. Emily stood by me, silent, her hand gripping mine. I didn't say much that day, but inside, I made a promise. "Edward, I'll protect what we built. No one will tear it apart." And for years, I kept that promise. I returned to work 2 weeks after the funeral. The company needed stability, and I gave it, taking every meeting, handling every contract, personally visiting every site. Under my leadership, we secured the Atlanta Skyline redevelopment project, our biggest achievement yet. We bounced back stronger than ever. But success has a strange way of revealing people's hearts. The stronger the company grew, the colder Daniel became. He began pushing me out of major decisions, slowly introducing his own people, creating distance between me and the company I built. At first, I thought he was just trying to prove himself. But deep down I knew, it wasn't ambition anymore. It was greed. He didn't want to continue my legacy. He wanted to erase it, and replace it with his own name. And that, I realize now, was the beginning of everything I was about to lose. And everything I would later take back. I often wonder if Edward knew the storm that would come after him. Maybe he saw it in Daniel's eyes, that quiet hunger that had stopped being ambition and turned into obsession. Or maybe he saw it in me, the way I refused to let go, even when my hands were bleeding from holding too much for too long. Edward's death wasn't just the loss of a husband. It was the death of balance. He had always been the calm between Daniel's ambition and my discipline. Without him, there was only noise. Daniel's growing authority, investors' demands, and a mother's desperate attempt to hold it all together. The day before he passed, Edward had called me into his hospital room. The smell of antiseptic still lingers in my mind, mixed with the faint scent of the lavender lotion I rubbed on his hands. He looked weak, yet his eyes had that same steady fire. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "Promise me one thing, Maggie. No matter what happens, never let Daniel sell our name." I frowned through tears. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "He's brilliant, but he doesn't understand legacy. To him, it's all numbers. He'll want to expand too fast, to take shortcuts. Don't let him gamble what we built." "I won't," I promised. And I meant it. But what I didn't know was that one day, keeping that promise would make me the enemy in my own family. After Edward's funeral, Daniel stepped forward as if the world already owed him leadership. He began to take meetings with board members, attend investment dinners, and send out press statements without consulting me. Every article referred to him as the future of Lawson Properties. I told myself it was harmless, that he was simply proud of our name. But pride, I learned, is just greed with better manners. Months passed. I threw myself into work, building new projects to distract from the ache inside me. Emily worked beside me, quiet, focused, always asking questions. She was the only person who could still make me smile. Daniel, on the other hand, began acting like I was just a figurehead. One morning, during a board meeting, he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Mom, with all due respect, the board agrees that we should move forward with the Jacksonville development. You don't need to worry about the details." I looked around the table, men who had known me for decades, now looking away. I realized what was happening. Daniel was consolidating power, using charm and confidence to edge me out. When the meeting ended, I called him into my office. He stood there, arms crossed, the picture of arrogance. "Daniel," I said, "you're talented, but you're moving too fast. We can't overextend into 3 states at once." He rolled his eyes. "You're afraid to grow, Mom. That's your problem. Dad would have supported me." My voice broke, softer than I wanted. "Don't use your father's name to justify your greed." His face hardened. "It's not greed. It's ambition." "No," I said quietly, "ambition builds. Greed destroys. And you're too blind to see which one you've become." He didn't respond. He just walked out. And that silence. It was the beginning of a wall I couldn't break through. Over the next 2 years, the gap widened. Daniel began signing contracts under his own authority. He transferred smaller assets, created shell companies, and used company funds for side ventures. Every time I confronted him, he found a way to twist the truth. Vanessa, his wife, only made things worse. She whispered poison with a smile, subtle comments like, "Maybe it's time to think about retirement, Margaret. You've done enough." Enough. That word became a weapon. The people I had mentored now followed Daniel's orders. The assistants who once greeted me with warmth now offered polite smiles and lowered eyes. The empire Edward and I had built together, every brick, every beam, was slowly being taken from me by my own son. I tried to involve Emily in board discussions, hoping to balance Daniel's recklessness. She attended one meeting, spoke intelligently about sustainable architecture, and earned quiet nods from the older partners. But afterward, Daniel pulled her aside and told her, "Stay out of this, Emily. You're just making it worse." She came to me crying that night, saying, "Mom, he's changing. He's not the brother I grew up with." I hugged her tightly and whispered, "He'll learn someday. The higher a man builds without character, the harder he falls." But I didn't realize that the fall wouldn't come to him first. It would come to me. It was around that time that I began setting contingencies. Edward had always trusted my foresight, and I had learned to trust my instincts. Quietly, I created a holding trust, a private legal entity that owned 70% of all Lawson Properties' major assets and land deeds. The trust was in my name, with Mr. Harper, our family's attorney, as the secondary executor. If anything happened to me, the trust would automatically pass to Emily. No one knew. Not even Daniel. To him, I was just an old woman slowly losing her grip. To me, he was a son walking into a storm. And I was quietly building the shelter he'd one day need, whether he deserved it or not. But storms don't wait for wisdom. They come when the skies are still pretending to be clear. And my storm arrived one evening, 3 years after Edward's death. Daniel barged into my office, slammed a file on my desk, and said, "You're done. I'm taking full control. Sign the transfer, or I'll have you removed." I stared at him, then at the photo of his father on the wall behind him. Edward's kind eyes seemed to look down at both of us, one builder, one destroyer. I said calmly, "I promised your father I'd never let you sell our name." He sneered. "Then you'll lose it all." I smiled faintly, knowing what he didn't. "No, Daniel. You already have." That was the day I realized. My battle was no longer about a company. It was about my soul as a mother, my dignity as a woman, and the legacy of everything I had ever loved. There is no loneliness like the one that grows under your own roof. After that confrontation in my office, I could feel the walls of my own company closing in on me. Daniel didn't fire me outright. He didn't need to. He simply made it impossible for me to exist there. My calendar mysteriously cleared, my access to internal reports was restricted, and my office was moved from the top floor to a quiet corner suite. I'd founded the company, but now I needed permission to enter the building I built. Mr. Harper, my lawyer, advised me to stay calm. Let him believe he's in control, Margaret, he said. You still own the trust. That's what truly matters. But ownership means little when your own child treats you like a guest in your legacy. So when Daniel insisted that I move in with him, claiming he wanted to take care of me, I accepted. I didn't do it because I trusted him. I did it because I needed to see what he was becoming. Sometimes, a mother has to walk into the fire to understand how far the flames have spread. The house was enormous. Cold marble floors, grand staircases, glass walls that reflected nothing but emptiness. Vanessa greeted me at the door with that polished smile that never reached her eyes. Welcome, Margaret, she said sweetly. Your room is upstairs. Daniel had it prepared for you. I wanted to tell her it was my design, every inch of it. But I didn't. I simply nodded and followed her up. The room was immaculate, like a hotel suite, large, perfect, and lifeless. There were no family photos, no warmth, no trace of belonging. I ran my fingers across the windowpane, looking out at the manicured lawn and the city skyline beyond. Atlanta had never looked so far away. That night at dinner, I saw the new hierarchy of this house, and I was no longer at the head of the table. Daniel sat in Edward's old place. Vanessa across from him, their two teenage children staring at screens instead of talking. I waited for Daniel to say grace as his father used to, but he just started eating. Long day? I asked, breaking the silence. He didn't look up. Every day's long when you're the one keeping everything running. I remember those days, I said softly. When your father and I were building the company, there were nights we didn't sleep for days. Vanessa smiled tightly. Yes, but those were simpler times, weren't they, Margaret? You didn't have digital infrastructure, global clients, or shareholders. I looked at her, calm and unblinking. No, Vanessa. We only had something much harder, integrity. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. Mother, he snapped, don't start. I didn't, I said gently. You did. He exhaled, frustrated, and pushed his plate away. You just can't help making everything about the past. Maybe that's why people don't take you seriously anymore. The words stung, but I smiled anyway. Perhaps. But the past is what built the floor you're standing on, Daniel. Don't forget that. He stood abruptly and left the table, leaving his food untouched. Vanessa stayed behind, pretending to eat, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction, like someone who'd just watched a scene she'd been waiting for. Over the next few weeks, my stay became a test of endurance. At first, things were civil. I helped around the house, cooked occasionally, even took my grandchildren to school. But slowly, I began to feel the shift, the subtle push toward silence. The driver no longer waited for me in the mornings. My company email access was temporarily deactivated. The household staff began addressing me as Mrs. Lawson Sr. instead of Mrs. Lawson. Vanessa began redecorating parts of the house, tearing down the old family portraits, replacing them with glossy magazine covers of her and Daniel at charity events. When I mentioned it, she smiled and said, "It's time the house reflects the new generation." But the final blow came one Sunday morning. I was in the living room reading when Daniel walked in, holding a folder. His face was calm, but his eyes had that sharp glint I'd seen too many times, the one that meant he'd already decided something cruel. "Mother," he said, "I need you to sign this. It's just a simplification for the family estate. A restructuring of ownership titles." I set the book down and took the papers from his hand. The moment I saw the signatures section, my stomach turned. It wasn't simplification, it was transfer of ownership. He was trying again, quietly, to take what wasn't his. "Daniel," I said, looking up, "we've had this conversation." He sighed. "You don't understand how business works anymore, Mom. We can't have assets under your name if you're not active in operations. It complicates the tax structure." I smiled faintly. "You mean it complicates your control?" "Don't twist this," he snapped. "I'm doing this for the family." "For the family," I repeated slowly. "The same family you've been pushing out of your own house?" He clenched his jaw. "If you don't sign this, you're making things worse for everyone." I folded the papers neatly and handed them back. Then let them get worse, Daniel. Something inside him broke at that moment. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Why can't you just do as you're told for once?" The room fell silent. Even Vanessa appeared in the doorway, pretending to look surprised, though I knew she'd been listening all along. "You always think you know better," Daniel shouted. "You can't accept that your time is over. That you are over." I stood, calm as a storm before thunder. "If I'm over, Daniel, then why are you still fighting me?" His nostrils flared. "Because you're standing in my way." That was the first time he said it aloud, the truth beneath all the lies. He wasn't trying to protect the company. He was trying to erase me from it. I took a slow breath, my voice steady. "I built Lawson Properties with love. You're trying to rebuild it with greed. One will stand. The other will fall. Time will decide which." He glared at me, trembling with anger. "You'll regret this, Mom." "No," I said softly. "You will." He turned and stormed off. Vanessa stayed behind for a moment, watching me with that same false sweetness. "You know, Margaret," she said, walking closer, "you should think about your health. Stress isn't good for women your age." I smiled. "Neither is betrayal, Vanessa. But here we are." She froze, her smile faltering, and I walked past her, leaving her to stare at the woman she still couldn't intimidate. That night, I sat in my room with a single lamp on, my hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the realization that I couldn't stay any longer. He had already thrown me out emotionally. All that was left was the physical act. So I prepared for it. I gathered my essentials, my wallet, some jewelry, the safe deposit key, and a small box of old family photos. Then, I called Mr. Harper. "It's time," I said. "Are you sure?" "Yes. I need to make changes. Tomorrow morning." When I hung up, I sat by the window, looking at the sprawling city that glittered beneath the rain. I remembered every foundation Edward and I had laid, every wall we had built, every sacrifice we had made. And I whispered to the night, "If this house is the price of dignity, then let it burn. I'll rebuild from ashes before I kneel under my own roof." The next morning, Daniel made that decision for me. He came into my room with cold eyes, holding my suitcase in one hand. "I think it's best if you leave," he said flatly. "You're upsetting everyone." I stood quietly, picked up my coat, and walked toward the door. As I reached the threshold, he muttered, "Old poor woman." I paused, turned back, and looked at him. "I may be old, Daniel," I said, "but poor is the one who's lost his soul." Then I walked out into the rain, again. Only this time, I didn't leave broken. I left ready. The rain that morning wasn't just falling, it was cleansing. It washed away everything I'd been clinging to, the walls that no longer felt like home, the title that had lost its meaning, and the illusion that love alone could save my son from himself. By the time I reached the bus stop, my coat was drenched, but my mind had never been clearer. I wasn't leaving in defeat. I was leaving to reclaim what was mine. I checked into a small downtown hotel under a quiet name, Margaret Ellis, the name I had before wealth, before fame, before disappointment. It felt like I was meeting an old version of myself again, the woman who built Lawson Properties from nothing but a pencil, a sketchbook, and a dream. That night, I opened my phone and called Mr. Harper, my lawyer and oldest friend. He answered on the first ring. "Margaret? I've been waiting for your call." "Tomorrow," I said, "we start. Everything I told you before, the trust, the transfer, the contingency. I want it all finalized." He hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want to give Daniel one more chance?" "Mr. Harper," I replied quietly, "he already took his chance, and he used it to throw me out into the rain." There was a pause. Then his voice softened. "All right. I'll prepare everything by morning." The next morning, I arrived at Harper & Associates, a law firm as old as the city itself. The mahogany walls smelled of ink and memory. As I walked through the hallway, I could almost hear Edward's voice from years ago, saying, "One day, we'll build something that lasts beyond us." Well, that day had come, but not the way we'd imagined. Mr. Harper greeted me with a stack of documents neatly arranged in a leather folder. "This," he said, sliding the first paper toward me, "is the revised ownership deed. All remaining assets of Lawson Properties and Designs that were still in your name, land, intellectual property, and holdings, are now consolidated under the Lawson Legacy Trust." I nodded. "And the executor?" "Still me," he said. "And the successor beneficiary, your daughter, Emily Lawson." Hearing her name gave me strength. Emily had called me the night before, her voice trembling with worry. "Mom, are you okay? Daniel told me you left." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I'd said gently. "I just needed some air." "You shouldn't be alone." "I'm not," I told her. "I'm with something better, my purpose." Now, as I signed the papers, I felt that purpose come alive again. Every stroke of my pen wasn't just a signature, it was a statement. "He thought he could take everything," I said quietly, "but what he didn't understand is that a foundation built with integrity can't be stolen. It has to be earned." Mr. Harper smiled. "Then let's make sure your legacy stays where it belongs." We spent the entire morning reviewing clauses. I ensured that every part of the trust was watertight. Daniel could fight all he wanted, but without my signature, he had no legal standing. I also created one additional document, something Edward and I had discussed years ago but never formalized: the Lawson Foundation for Urban Renewal, a non-profit organization that would use part of the company's profits to rebuild neighborhoods, fund scholarships for architecture students, and support women in design. I wanted the world to remember that our success was never about greed, it was about giving back. When the legal work was done, Mr. Harper handed me a sealed envelope. "This," he said, "is your insurance policy." Inside was a USB drive and a signed affidavit. The drive contained years of financial data proving Daniel's unauthorized transactions, secret accounts, misused company funds, falsified contracts. The affidavit was my statement, recorded and notarized. "If Daniel tries to declare you incompetent or claim control of the company," Harper said, "this goes to the press and the state authorities. I've already sent copies to my associate in case anything happens to either of us." I nodded, my throat tight. "You've always had my back, Harold." He smiled softly. "You built something remarkable, Margaret. But this is the part of the story where you build something untouchable." That afternoon, as I left his office, I walked past the skyline, the same skyline Edward and I had once dreamed of shaping. Every tower, every reflection, every shimmering window felt like a whisper of our journey. I stopped in front of one of our earliest projects, a modest but beautiful apartment complex built 30 years ago. The bronze plaque at its entrance still read, "Lawson Properties and Designs, building homes, not just houses." I traced the engraved letters with my fingers and smiled through the ache in my chest. "I kept my promise, Edward," I murmured. "Daniel may have your fire, but Emily has your heart." Mr. Harper helped me find a new place, a small, elegant apartment in Charleston, South Carolina, far from the noise of Atlanta's corporate chaos. It had wide windows that caught the ocean light and a balcony where I could see people walking their dogs in the mornings. It wasn't a mansion, but it was peaceful, and most importantly, it was mine. I spent my days revisiting old sketches, drinking coffee while sunlight poured over the pages, and calling Emily in the evenings. She'd tell me about her new design firm in Austin, about how she wanted to build eco-friendly communities inspired by my early work. "You always said architecture should tell a story," she'd say. "It should," I replied. "And every home should whisper something kind about the people who built it." Those moments reminded me why I'd started everything in the first place. Not for glory, not for money, but for the simple beauty of creating something that made people's lives better. And as the weeks passed, I realized something powerful. Daniel had taken my company, but I had kept my soul. 1 month later, Mr. Harper called. "He knows," he said simply. I closed my eyes. How angry. Very. He tried to access the company accounts and discovered the trust ownership structure. "He's furious, Margaret. He called me this morning, demanding to know where you are." I smiled faintly. "Then let him look. He'll find his reflection before he finds me." Harper chuckled. That's exactly what I told him. That night, as I watched the sunset over Charleston's harbor, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the peace of stillness, it was the peace that comes after surviving a war you never wanted but refused to lose. I whispered to the sea breeze. He may have my name, but I have my legacy. And that's something he'll never understand, until it's too late. It was early spring when Emily came back into my life, not as my little girl clutching sketchbooks, but as a woman with purpose in her stride and her father's quiet resolve in her eyes. I still remember that morning in Charleston. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. I was sitting on the balcony, sipping coffee and marking revisions on one of my old blueprints, when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it, and there she was. Emily, I breathed, almost disbelieving. She smiled softly, tears already welling in her eyes. Mom. We stood there for a moment that seemed to erase years of silence. Then she dropped her bag, and I wrapped my arms around her. For the first time in a long while, I felt warmth that wasn't borrowed from memory. She looked different, sharper, more confident, but her heart hadn't changed. She still hugged like a child who loved deeply. When she finally stepped back, I saw exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from fighting quiet battles. I couldn't stay there anymore, she said. Atlanta? I asked. She nodded. Daniel's changed everything. The company, the board, even the culture. He's replaced everyone who ever worked with you. It doesn't feel like Lawson Properties anymore. It feels like, she hesitated, his kingdom. I sighed. That's exactly what he wanted. Emily walked around the small apartment, running her hand across the furniture, the books, the old architectural models I'd kept. This place feels more like home than that mansion ever did, she said quietly. I designed it myself, I smiled. Every corner is honest. She laughed through tears. Of course you did. Over dinner, she told me everything, how Daniel had restructured the leadership team, sold off older projects, and taken massive loans in my company's name. How is he getting away with that? I asked. He's not yet, she said. He's drowning in expansion. But he's hiding it with glossy PR. The investors don't see the cracks. I've seen the numbers, Mom. He's walking straight into a collapse. I listened, silent, while she spoke, my mind already forming the lines of a plan. Then we won't stop him, I said finally. We'll let him build his tower as high as he wants. Because when it falls, I looked at her, it'll clear the sky for you. She frowned. Mom, I don't want revenge. This isn't revenge, I said softly. It's restoration. There's a difference. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I began to work in silence. No office, no titles, just two women with notebooks, laptops, and a lifetime of unfinished business. We spent our days drafting new concepts for community-driven housing, projects that combined sustainable design with local craftsmanship. Emily's mind was brilliant. She had inherited her father's structural logic and my sense of aesthetic soul. At night, we worked side by side, illuminated by the glow of our screens. I watched her typing proposals, adjusting design software, sketching outlines, the same way I used to when Edward and I were starting out. One evening, she looked up and said, Mom, what if we launched this as a new firm? I smiled. We already have. And just like that, Anderson and Lawson Designs was born. A new architectural firm under my maiden name, built quietly in the shadow of what Daniel thought he owned. We didn't announce it publicly. Instead, we reached out to a few of my old clients, people who still believed in the heart behind every home we ever built. The response was overwhelming. Margaret, I thought you'd retired. Your designs made our house a home. We'd love to work with you again. Every call, every handshake, every small contract was like a heartbeat returning to a body thought dead. Within months, our designs were being noticed, sustainable, elegant, deeply human. Local media began writing small features about a mother-daughter design duo changing the face of Southern architecture. Emily laughed when she read one headline aloud. The return of the real Lawson vision. I didn't even tell them we were related, she said. You didn't have to, I smiled. Truth always finds its way home. It wasn't long before Daniel noticed. I received the first call from him in late summer. He didn't even say hello. "You think you can embarrass me?" he spat through the phone. "You and Emily, playing family business in your little apartment?" I stayed silent. "You're destroying everything I've worked for." "Daniel," I said calmly, "you're doing that yourself. We're just rebuilding what you broke." "You don't understand what you've started," he shouted. "Investors are questioning me. Reporters are asking if Lawson Properties is collapsing." "Maybe it's time they knew the truth," I replied. There was a long silence. Then he said quietly, "You'll regret this." And he hung up. I didn't hear from him again for weeks. But I could sense his panic growing. The more our new firm thrived, the more desperate he became to prove his dominance. He began taking reckless loans, cutting corners, and even using fake subcontractors to inflate profits on paper. I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. One night, Emily and I sat on the balcony, sipping tea as the city lights danced on the harbor. "Mom," she said softly, "do you think he'll ever understand what he's done?" I looked at the horizon. The same way I used to look at Edward when we dreamed about the future. "Maybe one day," I said. "But sometimes people don't change until life forces them to." She nodded. "And when that day comes?" I smiled faintly. "We'll be ready." And we were. Because the truth wasn't just written in legal documents or bank ledgers. It was written in the walls of every home we built. Walls that stood tall, honest, and unshaken. Lawson Properties might have been falling, but the foundation of integrity, that still belonged to us. That night, as I closed my eyes, I thought of Edward again. I whispered into the quiet. "Your daughter has your fire now, my love. And your son? Well, he's about to learn what happens when you build a house without a foundation." The story was no longer just mine. It was ours. The collapse didn't come as a thunderclap. It came like a slow, suffocating fog, creeping into every corner of Daniel's empire until even he couldn't see what was falling apart. By autumn, the headlines had begun to shift. At first, they were subtle. Lawson Properties faces minor investor inquiry. Sources report internal audit underway. But within weeks, the tone changed. Whistleblower exposes financial mismanagement at Lawson Properties. Investors file lawsuit against CEO Daniel Lawson. The empire that once stood as a monument to Edward's dreams was now a battlefield of numbers, names, and lawsuits. And Daniel, my son, my flesh and blood, was at the center of it, fighting ghosts he had created himself. I didn't celebrate when I read the first report. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I only felt sadness, the deep, heavy kind that mothers carry when love and grief are tangled together. Still, the truth had to rise, even if it broke what was left of our family. It started when one of Daniel's former accountants, a man named Jeremy, reached out to a journalist at the Atlanta Herald. Jeremy had discovered irregularities in the company's financials, falsified invoices, hidden accounts, and millions in unreported losses. When the story broke, Daniel tried to suppress it with his usual arrogance. He called it a misunderstanding, accused the press of targeting a successful black entrepreneur, and even threatened legal action. But numbers don't lie, and neither did the documents Mr. Harper had quietly prepared years ago. Because when the media reached out to confirm their findings, Harper sent them an anonymous package. Sealed documents, signed affidavits, and years of financial records that Daniel thought he'd buried. The next day's headline was the one that changed everything. Exclusive, Lawson Properties built on fraud, sources confirm internal family conflict behind collapse. Daniel's face was plastered across every major business outlet. Investors withdrew funding, government agencies launched investigations, and the company's stock value plummeted overnight. He called me that evening, the first time in months. His voice trembled between anger and desperation. "You did this," he hissed. "You destroyed me." I closed my eyes. "No, Daniel. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped protecting the lie." "You think you're better than me?" "No," I whispered. "I just remember who I am." He didn't reply. The line went dead. That night, I sat by the window staring at the rain, the same kind of rain that had soaked me the day he'd thrown me out. Only this time, the sound didn't feel like grief. It felt like cleansing. Within weeks, the empire crumbled. Projects halted mid-construction, employees resigned, and creditors demanded payment. Daniel's mansion, the house that had once gleamed like pride itself, became a symbol of arrogance turned to ruin. Reporters camped outside its gates, cameras flashing as moving trucks carried away furniture, awards, and framed magazine covers. Vanessa was the first to leave. She took the children and fled to her parents' home in Dallas, refusing to answer calls or speak to the press. Daniel, cornered and humiliated, tried to salvage what was left. But the more he fought, the deeper he sank. Eventually, the board, once his allies, voted to remove him as CEO. The company was placed under investigation for financial misconduct, and Daniel faced multiple lawsuits. When the court hearings began, he arrived looking thinner, older, his once polished suit hanging loose on his frame. The fire that had once driven him now flickered weakly in his eyes. I didn't attend the first hearing, but Emily did. When she returned, she sat quietly beside me for a long time before saying, "He looked lost, Mom. Like he couldn't recognize himself anymore." I nodded slowly. That's what happens when a man builds his world on shadows. 2 months later, I was summoned to testify, not against him, but to verify the legitimacy of the Lawson Legacy Trust. The courtroom was cold, sterile, full of strangers with pens ready to record every detail of our family's tragedy. When I took the stand, Daniel was sitting just a few feet away. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The attorney asked the usual questions, about the company, about Edward, about the trust. I answered every one clearly, calmly, without bitterness. Finally, the judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "do you wish to question the witness?" Daniel hesitated, then stood. His voice was hoarse. "No, Your Honor." But just as I began to leave, he looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw my son. Not the man who betrayed me, but the boy who used to follow his father around job sites, asking questions about buildings and dreaming of greatness. "Mom," he whispered. His voice broke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I paused, my heart twisting in my chest. "I know," I said softly. "But once you start building on a lie, Daniel, it doesn't matter how high you climb, the ground will always remember." Tears filled his eyes, but he said nothing more. The judge called for recess, and I walked past him, past the man who had destroyed my trust and lost himself in the process. I didn't hate him, but I couldn't save him either. The same week Daniel's company filed for bankruptcy, Anderson and Lawson Designs received its largest contract yet, the redevelopment of the Charleston waterfront, a $50 million project aimed at sustainable housing. The news spread fast. Headlines once filled with scandal now carried new names. Mother-daughter duo revive Southern architecture with heart and vision. Anderson and Lawson, building empathy into design. Emily handled the business side with brilliance and grace. I oversaw creative design. Together, we became what Edward had always dreamed of, builders of homes, not empires. One evening, after finalizing a new project proposal, Emily handed me a letter. "What's this?" I asked. "It's from the city council," she said. "They're naming the new community after you, Margaret's Crossing." I smiled, tears filling my eyes. "That's beautiful." "You earned it, Mom," she said, hugging me. "You didn't just build buildings. You built people." That night, as I stood by the ocean and watched the waves shimmer under the moonlight, I whispered into the wind. "Edward, our legacy survived. It just needed a new foundation, and her name is Emily." I closed my eyes, feeling peace in every breath. Daniel had lost everything money could buy. But I had gained everything wealth never could, truth, love, and a legacy built on dignity. The empire had fallen, but from its ruins, something far stronger had risen. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a long, quiet road you walk barefoot, one step at a time, sometimes bleeding, sometimes trembling, but always moving forward. A full year passed after Daniel's downfall before I saw him again. The lawsuits had ended, the media frenzy had faded, and Atlanta had found a new scandal to feed on. Lawson Properties and Designs, The empire Edward and I had built brick by brick was gone, dissolved into history like dust swept away by the wind. But Anderson and Lawson Designs was thriving. Our firm had become a symbol of integrity and rebirth. Emily's leadership had drawn in clients from all over the country, and our Charleston waterfront project, Margaret's Crossing, had just been completed. The day the city cut the ribbon, I stood beside my daughter under a bright blue sky, surrounded by families moving into the homes we'd built. Laughter echoed down the clean streets, and children chased each other across lawns still soft with fresh grass. A reporter asked me that day, "Mrs. Lawson, how does it feel to see your name on these homes after everything you've been through?" I smiled. "It doesn't feel like victory," I said. "It feels like peace." Real success isn't about what you build, it's about what remains standing when everything else falls. That evening, as we celebrated quietly with the team, I received a message I didn't expect. It was from a local shelter in Decatur, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. A man named Daniel Lawson had checked himself in 2 months ago. They said he had requested no visitors but had recently asked if his mother was still alive. For a long time, I just stared at the message, my chest tight, my hands trembling. Emily saw the look on my face and immediately asked, "What happened?" "It's your brother," I whispered. Her eyes widened. "Daniel?" I nodded. "He's in a shelter." Silence fell between us, heavy, fragile. Then she placed her hand over mine. "Go," she said softly. "You should see him." The next morning, I drove back to Atlanta, the city that had once been my kingdom and my battlefield. It felt strange to see it again after so long. The skyline still shimmered, but to me, it no longer looked like ambition. It looked like memory. The shelter was small but clean, tucked between an old church and a park. A volunteer led me down a quiet hallway to a common room. "He's here every morning," she said. "He reads old newspapers and helps serve breakfast to the others." I turned the corner, and there he was. My son. His hair had grown out, streaked with gray. His once expensive clothes were now simple, his posture humbler. But the biggest change wasn't in how he looked, it was in his eyes. For the first time in years, they were clear. He saw me and froze, the tray in his hands shaking. Then he set it down slowly and whispered, "Mom." I walked toward him, each step heavy with memories. The first time I held him as a baby, the first time he called me Mama, the first time I saw him look at me like I was an obstacle. When I finally reached him, I didn't speak. I just opened my arms. He hesitated, and then he broke. He fell into me, sobbing like the boy he used to be. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked. "I lost everything. I thought I was doing what Dad would have wanted. I was wrong." I held him tighter. "I know. I ruined your life." I shook my head. "You didn't ruin it. You just gave me another reason to rebuild it." He cried harder, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "I don't deserve forgiveness." I lifted his chin, meeting his eyes. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Daniel. It's something you give when love refuses to die." We stood there in silence, mother and son, broken and rebuilt, bound by something far greater than success or failure. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began visiting me in Charleston. He helped volunteer at community sites and even joined one of Emily's small renovation projects. He was quiet most of the time, thoughtful, almost gentle. Emily was cautious at first, unsure whether to trust him. But one evening, as we all sat by the beach after finishing a site inspection, Daniel looked at her and said, "You saved Mom. I didn't even realize how much I'd lost until I saw what you both built." Emily smiled faintly. "You didn't lose everything, Daniel. You just needed to find the right place to start again." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Maybe that's what Dad meant when he said homes should outlive us. Maybe he wasn't talking about buildings at all. I looked out over the horizon, the golden sun sinking into the waves, and whispered. He was talking about family. For the first time in many years, we all sat together. Not as CEO and heir, not as enemies or rivals, but as the Lawsons, the family that once fell apart but somehow found its way back together. A few months later, Emily surprised me with a new proposal. a community development project called the Lawson Renewal Initiative. It would provide affordable housing and design mentorship programs for underprivileged families, teaching young architects how to build both ethically and sustainably. "Mom," she said, "I want this to be our legacy, not skyscrapers, but homes that carry stories." I nodded, tears in my eyes. "Your father would be proud. So am I." And that's how our story came full circle. The empire built on ambition had crumbled, but the one built on compassion had begun to rise. It's been 5 years since then. Emily now runs Anderson and Lawson Designs full-time, expanding across states while maintaining the same values that started it all. Daniel, after years of humility and service, now manages our non-profit housing foundation, quietly, sincerely, with no need for spotlight. As for me, I've retired to a quiet home overlooking the ocean. My days are slow, peaceful. Sometimes I still wake before dawn, sketching outlines on old paper, little homes by the sea, the kind that remind me of where everything began. People often ask if I ever regret building Lawson properties, if I wish I had lived differently. I always give the same answer. No. Because even the greatest storms have a purpose. They strip away what's false and leave behind what's real. I devoted my life to building walls, but in the end, what mattered most were the people who stood within them, the family I almost lost, and the love I found again. Edward once said, "Our buildings will outlive us." He was right, but not in the way we imagined. Because the truest thing we ever built wasn't Lawson Properties. It was us.